What I'm going to do in this seminar, briefly, I'm going to introduce the topic and the background to the topic, and then I'll be focusing on some of the contextual themes arising from the papers. Then that will lead on to Harriet, who will be talking about poor outcomes, enduring unresolved issues, and progress over time. That should leave us about 20 minutes at least for discussion, which will include discussion from the authors of the papers. So why do young people's transitions from care matter? Well, care leavers represent less than about 1% of the 16 to 19 youth population in most countries. And their transitions to adulthood are often very different from those moving on from their families. As we know, most young people leave care between 16 and 18 years of age, and that marks the end of the state's legal responsibility for care in most European and international countries. But that contrast, those transitions contrast with the extended, supported, non-linear and normative transitions of young people who leave home. Many, according to the latest European data, from the late 20s and early 30s. In fact, and often many return. It's a non-linear transition. They're often called the yo-yo generation. Most countries do have legal responsibilities providing services after young people leaving care, but the international research evidence shows this is of great variability and often includes inadequate support. We also know that support for care leavers is emblematic of society's approach to numerous wicked issues such as social exclusion, mental health, poverty, asylum seeking, which impact upon the youth population. In fact, care leavers are first of all young people, and they're subject to the major structural, economic and social policy changes that affect young people more generally in society at different historical moments. And also they have to be understood in a global context, as asylum seeking reminds us every day. The background to the seminar arises out of the International Research Network on Transitions to Adulthood from Care, or INTRAC, which was set up in 2003. By now, 2021, it's representative leading care researchers from Europe, the Middle East, Australia, Canada, the US, Asia, Africa, and South American countries. It's a very large representative organisation of researchers. Members of the history group with INTRAC contributed 8 papers, including an editorial on young people's transitions from care to adulthood. And as I said earlier, that they're going to be in the special issue of Child and Family Social Work. The papers cover about 150 years in 6 countries, 2 from England, India, Romania, Northern Ireland, Norway and Switzerland. And this seminar will introduce cross-cutting themes from the editorial. So, although a small and select group of countries, the papers are contextualized by themes which connect with the history of welfare policies in many societies. The first paper, Transitions to Adulthood from Care in 19th Century England, is set in the context of the economic and social consequences of industrialization. And that led in many societies to deterrent poor laws, pauper industrial schools, charitable organizations. And at that time, from the 19th century, the aftercare of young people leaving these institutions became a social and economic issue. There were concerns from that time onwards about the economic dependency of young people leaving care, and Harriet will be taking up some of these issues later. But there's also, with all historical areas, a legacy. The ongoing legacy of poor law and the 19th century treatment lies in the persistence or the low status of the poor law child right up to today of children in care. And again, it's a theme Harriet will be taking up. A second area, the second paper, is the development of leaving care, law, policy and practice in India. And that's set in the context of empire, colonialism and independence. And globally, as we're reminded very recently, this history continues to be played out in the form of in colonialist and post-colonial societies. And there's also a connection broader with communist societies as well, nations that dominate and control other societies. And we see that in both the Northern Ireland and Romanian papers. The legacy of racism is the spectrum of racism which Black and minority ethnic care leavers have to confront in their everyday lives, often being brought up in white care situations. There are complex identity issues, particularly for young people of mixed heritage, the separation of many from Black and minority ethnic communities, and there's evidence of structural racism, particularly amongst Black British ethnic minorities, who often experience this as being brought up in the poorest, some of the poorest areas in the cities of our country. And that results in the overrepresentation of Black British young people from care in the care system. This is a Black children need Black families. Could you foster a child? This is from 1986, and it's still an issue today in terms of providing diverse care. The next paper, Leaving Care in Norway, that's set in a context of the rise of social democracy, universalism and selectivity. We've seen in Norway the rise of the new social democratic politics from 1945, where a prime principle of the welfare state in the Nordic model was providing non-stigmatizing, universalist services for all young people, including in those in care. The assumption being that universalist services would be able to meet those needs. However, research and practice has led to recognition of specialist needs and services. And again, the legacy of that is that the balance between universal and specialist services for care leavers is an ongoing issue in many countries. For example, in relation to housing, how far should that be specialist for care leavers? How far should it be part of universal housing, which presents opportunities for integration? Again, with financial support, how much should be specialist? How much should be universal? And again, with employment, how much should be specialist schemes for care leavers, or how much should be integrated within general employment opportunities for young people? So the ongoing debate between universalist and specialist services is a very important one. The next paper is Transitions from Care to Adulthood in Switzerland. And the contextual theme is very much around regulation and control in residential care. From the mid-19th century onwards, institutions often used to reinforce middle-class norms. And then from the 1950s, as this paper highlights, residential care was seen as a remedy for children from poor families in many Western societies. And that's again an ongoing issue. The legacy issues, of course, relate to the variation in the use of residential care in different societies. For example, in India, it was a family replacement when families were affected by the impact of poverty and migration. So institutions and residential care filled a place. Whereas in Romania, residential care was deliberately set up as a policy to achieve the socialization and education of the new socialist belief and young people. It also, of course, covers a spectrum in the legacy to the importance of residential care as a positive choice. And we see that in some of the Scandinavian countries, underpinned by strong theoretical perspective, as we see in relation to social pedagogy. So regulation and control in residential care. We like to treat all our young people as individuals. This, for example, is individual number 16976. This always makes me smile. These cartoons were incidentally done by an ex-care leaver who became an eminent cartoonist. And I often use them in my presentations, as those who are here now will know. The next area is Romania, from the new man to care leaver activists, exploring major changes that have taken place in Romania, shaping 50 years of leaving care. And it's set in the context of the transformation from communist societies to market societies. And that, of course, has been a major political and radical transformation in many European, and not to forget also Central Asian communist societies from the 1990s. What we see in the legacy from this paper is how these changes have defined and redefined quite radically what it means to be a care leaver and leaving care. And the history traced includes history of institutional care, the impact of the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child, and the development of the care leavers' rights movement. And again, we've seen that in the Swiss and the English papers. The next history takes a different approach, exploring the history in the social ecology of care leaving and using Northern Ireland as an illustration. Excuse me 1 second. Just water, not real ale, unfortunately, but there we are. And this paper is set in the context by using Bronfenbrenner's ecology of human development, a conceptual framework for understanding both biographical and historical change. It provides a micro to a macro layered systems perspective, and it illustrated by drawing on leaving care developments in Northern Ireland between 1968 and 2018. So it covers the period of the Troubles, it covers the period of the Brexit, of leaving the EU. So the contextual areas are of major significance. And that's reflected in the legacy of Northern Ireland. Sometimes we forget, although we should never do so, the colonial influence of Great Britain, but also, as this paper traces, the impact of the United Nations Convention of the Rights of the Child, the developments of the young people's rights movement. And again, there are examples within India, Romania, the England papers, but also in many other countries do we see the colonial, the UNCRC development of rights in many different countries as well. Right, I'm making good time here. I'm just still in my time. The final paper is about the rights movement of young people living in and leaving care between 1973 and 2011. It's very much a history from below, a history based upon young people's involvement in the rights movement and their words, their voices, and their experiences of struggle. It's set in the context then of participation and children's rights. And there's been a number of very important developments. Clearly from the 1970s, young people's organisations campaigning to improve their lives whilst living in and leaving care. And these now, as we know, have developed in many countries, some from that time onwards, internationally, both in Western European and post-communist societies. In fact, they're increasingly seen as a very important part of the rights landscape. But probably the most significant development in terms of rights was from 1989 with the introduction of the United Nations Convention of the Rights of the Child. That became a global landmark, and that is referenced in the papers in India, Romania, Northern Ireland, but it had a massive influence on the development not just of leaving care services, but childcare services in many countries in the world. So it's very, very important indeed. The legacy and the important legacy issues lie in the increased recognition of the rights of young people in and leaving care to participate in decisions which shape their lives. Now, I think that participatory rights have in some ways, lagged behind rights to provision and protective rights, but not anymore. And I think that the care leavers groups have helped to redefine the landscape, so that in many countries now, that not just consultation, but active participation and involvement in rights has become a very important part of the policy and legal context of those countries. I think I've got 2 minutes left just to show the final cartoon. So increased recognition of the rights of young people, the rights to complain. So apart from food, housing, support, planning process, is there anything else you're not happy with? Well, that tie sucks, to use a bit of contemporary language. Okay, I'm now going to pass over to Harriet Ward for her contribution. I've done it within 19 minutes, so you have an extra minute, Harriet. Okay.
Thank you very much. Now we're going to have what we hope is going to be a smooth transition. I'm going to ask Mike if I can click on his slides, and if I can't, we're going to have to provide another option.
Yes, you certainly can. Can you?
So,
all right, here we are, approve.
Yes, it seems to work. Well, hello, everybody. Thank you very much for coming to this seminar. Mike has gone through the individual papers and explored the issues that are related to specific economic, social, and political contexts. I'm going to try to look at some of the common themes that are evident in all or most of the papers and explore the historical antecedents to them and how they have played out over the course of time. And one of the obvious concerns, one of the obvious themes is concerns about poor outcomes for care leavers. It's a universal issue. It's common to every country that we have studied, and it's been a common driver for policy initiatives everywhere that we have looked. And those concerns are long-standing. In England, the first evidence I've found of concerns about poor outcomes for care leavers comes in 1805, when there were concerns about young people who left the care of the Foundling Hospital. Then in the mid-19th century, there were concerns about young people who'd been brought up in the workhouse, who didn't cope very well when they moved to independence. And those concerns grew throughout the 19th century in England until Jane Nassau Senior was commissioned to undertake what I think has been the first formal research study of outcomes for young people who had left care, outcomes for care leavers. She looked at about 500 girls who had left the care of poor law schools in the 1870s, and she found much the same results as we find today, that care leavers are less likely than other children and young people in the community to be in gainful employment as they approach adulthood, less likely to have qualifications, more likely to become homeless, to become involved in crime or prostitution, or to become dependent on the state in adulthood. We're going to look a bit more closely at that in a minute, but there's something I want to make clear before we do that. Except that I can't click. Yes. Let's get this absolutely clear. By no means every care leaver follows a negative life trajectory. Do not believe everything you read in the papers. Mike has identified 3 groups of care leavers with different outcomes. There's a relatively small group of young people who move on, who gain adequate qualifications, who move into employment, who have strong relationships with supportive adults, and for whom things go relatively well as they move to adulthood, very similar to other young people in the community. There's another relatively small group, however, of young people who face considerable challenges, for whom things don't go so well. These are the young people whose outcomes are poor, the young people who move into criminality, the young people who don't gain qualifications, who find it difficult to get employment, and for whom things don't go well. And then there is a much larger group of survivors, young people who have faced many challenges before they enter care, often considerable challenges while they're in care, and who leave care with considerable things to overcome, and who take a while before they settle down into positive life trajectories. Those young people do relatively well, but they often have a tricky patch before they move into adulthood, and they don't show up on the official statistics because they don't get their GCSEs at 16. They're not at university in their late teens. Things move more slowly for them, but given the right support, they do very well in adulthood. And just to make this clear too, research on outcomes of care in most countries shows that public care has a positive impact on children's welfare. In countries where there's widespread destitution and very poor welfare state and inadequate welfare state, care may be life-saving for large numbers of children, and studies of subjective well-being of young people in care show that many have positive experiences of care. So don't believe everything you read about care. However, what we really want to look at is the group of why care leavers are overrepresented in some of the negative outcomes and why this happens. Because once we know why this has happened and why it has been so long standing, that gets us into a position where things can improve. Well, one of the obvious issues is to do with poverty and disadvantage. For many years, and in every country that we've studied, there's a very close relationship between entry to care, poverty, and other forms of disadvantage. It's a complex relationship. It isn't as simplistic as one might expect. But we also know that a high proportion of young people who enter care are further disadvantaged in terms of education, health, and psychosocial development. And a very high proportion, about 2/3 in England, have been abused or neglected before they entered care. And one of the problems we have is that while care systems may protect children from further harm, they're not really set up to enable them to overcome the consequences of early adversity. They're not really designed to help children overcome consequences and to reduce the deficit that they have experienced. And sadly, we also now know that there is evidence of sexual, physical, and emotional abuse within care systems. And this is widespread across many societies with diverse welfare regimes. It's only really come to international attention relatively recently over the last, 30 to 50 years? But it's undoubtedly been prevalent for much longer than that, much longer than the 150 years covered by the papers in this special issue. But it's obviously one of the factors that lead to poor outcomes for care leavers. And in fact, those outcomes can be related to continuing failures to address the prevalence and consequences of abuse, both before and after entering care. One of the reasons why children in public care are at risk of abuse is related to social exclusion and to the powerlessness of their parents. These are children who don't have an adult watching their back, basically, and it's much more likely then that they will be abused because of that. Added to that, there is deliberate stigmatization of children in care. A very high proportion of children in care are illegitimate, and until the late 20th century, illegitimacy attracted massive stigmatization. It's hard to believe it now, but it's very evident, and that's clear in the papers from England and also from Switzerland. In fact, the care leavers who were interviewed in the Swiss paper talked about the impact of illegitimacy and how they were made to feel that their very existence was illegal, and that they had to strive particularly for success to overcome the stigmatization that they had experienced. The fact that birth parents tend to be powerless, those birth parents whose children come into care, has also made it possible to introduce policies that have been designed to sever the link between children and their families. Many of you will be aware of the juvenile immigration policies of the 19th and 20th centuries, where tens of thousands of children and young people from the UK were sent off to Canada, Australia, and South Africa on their own. And part of the policy was a deliberate attempt to sever the link, to break the link with their birth families. Those policies also persisted within the UK and in many other countries. There were attempts to break the link between children and their birth families and attempts to eradicate the culture of their families. That's evident in Switzerland. It's also evident in the paper from India and some of the other papers. And of course, the consequence has been that children in care are dissociated from their culture and traditional family links and responsibilities. Adults don't feel responsible for them. And when they come to leave care, care leavers have often found that there is nobody to whom they could return and nobody available to support them into adulthood. The system has not been robust enough to find alternative families who will support them, and it has deliberately broken the link with previous families. That's a universal issue evident in many of the papers. One of the issues about the perspective, the way in which birth parents were viewed, has been that they have been denigrated for many years. And there have been concerns that children will follow their birth parents' trajectories. And of course, some birth parents do act in a way that is detrimental to children, to child well-being. There are reasons why some children do have to be separated from them. But concerns that children will follow in the footsteps of their birth parents, become single parents, become dependent on the state, follow a life of crime, dissent in some of the communist countries, has led to very strict regimes in institutional care, which has been designed to break that link and to enforce conformity to cultural norms. Mike talked about conformity to middle class norms, but in fact, there's also conformity to specific cultures within societies. So in 19th century England, for instance, Christianity was very much promoted as a means of forcing children to adopt a particular lifestyle. Becoming respectable was also one of the objectives. And in communist countries, in the Romania paper, the objective was to turn children into the new socialist man, to follow a communist expectations. Very rigid regimes were followed in many institutions. Attempts were made to reduce individuality, to force children to follow a particular route. And one of the problems of institutionalization has been a negative impact on children's well-being and a reduction of initiative. Of course, it's very hard to cope on your own when you don't have an adult supporting you, moving towards independence, when you have had the initiative knocked out of you through the regime that you have been forced to follow. This is an obvious example of an attempt to force young people into a particular type of conformity. These are young people, young girls in the Foundling Hospital doing drill, a type of exercise. You can see how they are being required to follow a particular pattern. And indeed, their expectation is that they will go into service as adults, as you can see from their uniforms. And that's a picture of one of their dormitories. No evidence of any type of individuality, no personal possessions, nothing. An insistence on following a particular regime that crushes individuality. So we have this issue of the care systems that fail to enable young people to overcome consequences of abuse and neglect. We have care systems that break a link between young people and their birth families, care systems that have crushed individuality, made it harder for young people to make the transition to adulthood as care leavers. And I think one of the reasons that we have this long historical tradition in most of the countries that we have studied has been because there are a number of enduring and unresolved issues that come into prominence at different times in different societies, but are always there because they're never adequately resolved. One of these issues is about the purpose of care. What is its purpose? Why are children and young people looked after by the state? And what is the state aiming to do when it looks after children and young people? Is the purpose to instill conformity, or is it to promote individual opportunity? And papers from all these countries talk about the dilemma there, the problem about which is that objective, which is the major objective. There are other issues too. Is the purpose of care to protect troubled children from themselves and to help them, or to protect society from the trouble that they cause? One of the reasons that many institutions are placed in a long way from habitation right out in the depths of the country is to protect society from the children who were placed there. Real concerns about that and the impact that has on outcomes for those young people who leave those institutions. And in 1987, my first job was to act as a reporter for a group of people who were commissioned to a group of academics who commissioned to explore outcomes for children in care, to devise a system for assessing outcomes for children in care. And one of the questions that we were asked was whether the care system should be to provide shelter, to provide food, clothing, and accommodation for children until they reached adulthood and could leave, or was it to fulfill their aspirations, to help them to achieve their potential? That question has not really adequately been resolved. It keeps returning every so often. And there are also another issue really is many of these questions reflect conflicting policy objectives. Those who make policy always have to think about reducing dependency on the state, reducing the cost to the public purse, versus making sure that care leavers are adequately supported into adulthood. Whether we should ensure that children leave as fast as possible because then the cost of the public purse is less, or whether we should make sure that they're adequately supported so that they don't become dependent in later life. And in fact, the Victorians in England got into a terrible muddle about this. They got concerned about, one of the problems was that they had the principle of less eligibility, that the pauper situation on the whole should not be made really or apparently so eligible as the situation of the independent labourer of the lowest class, enshrined in the 1834 Poor Law Act, which means really that the state should never give children who are dependent on it anything more than parents would be able to provide. But at the time in the 1870s, in the 1830s in England, there was no universal education. So the question was, should pauper children dependent on the state be taught to read and write? And they got into a tremendous muddle, and they decided that in many poor law guardians decided that they could teach them to read because then they could read the Bible, but they shouldn't teach them to write because then they might write subversive texts. How it is possible to teach children to read or write, I hope someone from the Department of Education the Reese Centre is based, will be able to tell us. I haven't the faintest idea. But they got into this model because they didn't want to advantage pauper children over and above children whose parents were not dependent on the state. And then in Norway, where there is a very strong welfare state, that argument is inverted. Is it fair to give care leavers more than the state will provide, not more than their parents will provide? But again, this issue is much the same. It's the other side of the coin, something that hasn't been adequately resolved. And because of a failure to resolve these conflicting policy initiatives, we see the compressed and accelerated transitions that many care leavers experience. So as Mike has already shown, in many societies, care leavers make the transitions to independence much earlier than their peers do, at a much earlier age than other young people are expected to become independent of their families. And not only do they do that at a much earlier age, they're also expected to cope with many of the tasks of transitioning all at once. So they're expected to cope with leaving home, finishing their education, starting work, managing their finances, and sometimes becoming a parent all at the same time, when their peers in the community tend to do this sequentially in stages, not all together. So has there been progress? Well, I think there has. There have been a number of very valuable positive moves. We understand much more now than we have done in the past about children's developmental needs and the developmental needs of adolescents. We're now much more aware that adolescents need support as they move towards adulthood. It's not possible simply to lurch into independence without adequate support. And we know much more about how adolescents develop and become independent adults. There's also been a change in social mores, and I think one of the great advances that has been made over the last what, 30 or 40 years has been the end of stigmatization of illegitimacy. It's no longer a sin, it's no longer a disadvantage. That is a great advance, I think. There are also changes in perceptions of abuse. We understand now that care systems are liable to abuse. There have been a lot of apologies and so on, much more awareness, though sadly, inevitably that persists. As Mike has said, the United Nations Convention has been enormously important in promoting the rights of children. We acknowledge that there are rights as well as needs now, and the rights movement of young people in care has taken that forward and has an enormous impact, particularly in encouraging agency, participation in decision-making. And there have been a lot of, many countries now have legislation designed to support care leavers through the transition to adulthood. Many countries now also have policies to extend the period of support from 18. Young people can now stay with their foster carers after the age of 18 in certainly Northern Ireland and in England and Wales and in many other countries. And there have been policies designed to raise aspirations for care leavers as well. But a number of issues arose following the financial crash of 2008, and we don't know really what the impact of COVID has been yet, but undoubtedly it will have exacerbated some of these issues. Some countries have passed leaving care legislation, but they haven't been able to implement it. There's evidence of new systematic injustices in England and Wales. So the Children's Commission report of 2020 states that in the year 2018 to 2019, 12,800 16 to 17-year-olds spent time in unregulated accommodation that is allowed to provide support but not care, where adults aren't responsible for children all the time and where they're expected to fend for themselves and look after themselves. Many of these young people are asylum seekers, and the Immigration Act of 2016 withdrew eligibility for care leaver support for some unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. That's not been implemented, but it's part of the legislation. If we don't strongly oppose less eligibility, if we turn our backs, it's very easy for these injustices to reappear. There's also, of course, been an increase in indicators of exclusion and disadvantage in the wider society, in unemployment, in homelessness and poverty. Undoubtedly, that will affect care leavers as well, because their experiences tend to illuminate and cross over with those of the wider population. And as we know, any society, any nation is judged on the basis of how it treats its weakest members, the last, the least, the littlest. Thank you.